Now, in this model, we're going to talk about the culture of tithing, and we're going to look at whether or not tithing really was a universal principle, or is it more of like a cultural practice? And if that's kind of hard for you to understand right now, it's going to be more clear to you as we go along in this module. So just stay with me. But tithe advocators, they want you to think that in the days of Abraham, tithing was a practice that God required from his followers that is still in effect today. So the main argument that they give for this is the story of Abraham's tithe, which we'll read about a little later on in this lesson. But the picture that probably most Christians establish with the story of Abraham's tithe is this. This is what they say. Abraham gave a tithe to God through the priest Melchizedek in order to obey the universal principle of tithing. So when Christians today give their 10%, they're really honoring God by declaring that He is the true source and the true provider of all their increase, just like Abraham did. Now, again, that's what most tithe advocators probably really what most Christians believe about tithing. And that all sounds good, but as we'll find out, this is really just mainly an assumed interpretation of the story. For now, let me give you an alternative way of looking at Abraham's tithe. Abraham gave a tithe to the priest Melchizedek because it was a common cultural practice that many people in the land did with their own goods and their own priests. Nowhere in this story or after the law ended does God say that he requires a tithe. That's just another way that we can look at Abraham's tithe. Now, I know that that might seem like very different from what you've been taught about tithing your whole life. But let's face it, no one is really talking about the cultural side of tithing in Abraham's day. And I think that it can really shed a lot of light on the matter of tithing altogether. So let's just begin by carefully reading the story of Abraham's tithe. In Genesis chapter 14, verses 1 through 17, it tells us that five kings from around the area of Sodom and Gomorrah, they rebel against four other kings and they go to war. So it's these five kings versus these four kings and all their nations. However, the five kings, they get defeated and they get scattered. And when they get scattered, people and possessions were also taken. So this includes Abraham's nephew Lot, who gets taken captive since he was living around the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. So someone comes and tells Abraham what happened to Lot. So Abraham takes 318 of his trained servants to find these armies of the four kings and defeat them and take back Lot and all the spoils. Everything that was taken, he was going to get back. So Abraham finds and he ultimately defeats them and he rescues Lot. And many of you already know this story, right? And when Abraham returns from the battle, the king of Sodom meets him in the valley of Sheva. We pick it up in verses 18 through 20. Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20. Verse 18. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands. And he gave him a tithe of all. So we see that in this passage of scripture, a mysterious priest whose name is Melchizedek, he also comes to meet Abraham. And the only information that we know about him here is that he's a priest of God Most High. Again, it says that Melchizedek blesses Abraham and God Most High. Last, it says that Abraham gave him a tithe of all. Now, if we read further later on, way in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 7, verse 4 tells us that this is actually a tenth of the spoils of war. Now, we'll stop right here for now, and we'll look more at the story of Abraham's tithe and Melchizedek in Hebrews 7 later. But for now, we're just going to explore why Abraham gave a tithe. Does the story tell us that Abraham did it to honor or establish a universal tithing principle? Or was it more of a cultural thing? This is really important to talk about because tithe advocators will tell you that the fact that Abraham gave a tithe in the first place is proof that there is a universal tithing principle in effect by God. But we can't just assume that, right? All we see from this story is that Abraham gave a tithe of the spoils of war, and we have to figure out why he did it. So ultimately, there's really two ways that we can look at Abraham's tithe. Uh, there's an author of a book that I really enjoyed. His name is Joseph Blenkinsop, and he says that the tithe of Abraham could simply imply two things. The first thing that Abraham's tithe could imply is this: it could be simply an origin and a legitimation of the practice of tithing and the virtue of its great antiquity. This is how tithe advocators see it. I know that's kind of like a big phrase there, big words there, but let me explain. To them, to tithe advocators, tithing today is a legitimate practice because Abraham did it to assumingly obey a universal principle which shows that God is our true source. And when we tithe, we're honoring God as the sole provider of everything that we have, kind of like just like Abraham did, they say. But here's why I think that this is not a good interpretation of Abraham's tithe story. First, we have to understand that just because Abraham did something, that doesn't automatically mean that we are required or suggested to do the same thing. Now, when it comes to like Bible interpretation, this is generally called prescription versus description when it comes to interpreting scriptures. So, was the story of Abraham's tithe a prescription for all believers to obey for all times, or was it simply a description of what he did, a mere story to tell us what happened, and as we'll find out later, really to point us to Jesus? But there's no indicator in the context of the story itself that this is something that should be done by everyone at all times. So again, there's no indicator, there's no proof that God has prescribed us to do the same thing that Abraham did from this story alone. The second thing that we need to understand that about Abraham's tithe story and why it's really not a good reason for us to look at Abraham's tithe story as a proof for our tithing today is that it's true that one of the reasons for tithing in the law was so that the Israelites could honor God as their source. That is actually, I would say, one reason why the Israelites tithe in the Old Testament. It was to honor God and to recognize Him as their source. However, there's nothing in the Bible that tells us why Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek before the law. There's really no passage that tells us that. And again, most Christians just say that Abraham gave a tithe to recognize God as his source, but actually, there's no evidence for that. All that we know is that Abraham gave a tithe. This is important to know because many tithe advocators will use the assumption that Abraham tithed to honor God to strengthen their argument that it's a universal principle. And they say that Abraham did it to honor God, to recognize God as his source. So shouldn't we do the same thing? But scripture doesn't say this. Now, Abraham might have given his tithe to show honor towards his God. That's a valid possibility. And that's actually that's the widely accepted view of why Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek among Christians. And I'm not saying that that can't be true. But what I am saying is this: first, scripture doesn't say that. And then second, even if Abraham did tithe to give thanks to God, this still does not automatically make it a universal principle for everyone to obey. And then third, I would also say this is not talked about in the New Testament, anywhere in the New Testament. So if Abraham's tithe established a universal principle that all Christians should do today to recognize God as their true source, then I think it would be clearly laid out somewhere in the New Testament, but it's not. And then that great author that I mentioned a minute ago, the other explanation he gives for Abraham's tithe that he gives is this one. Number two, Abraham's tithe could establish the offering of part of war booty to a sanctuary and its personnel who do not take part in military action. In other words, this is what he's saying. He's saying that The other way that we can look at Abraham's tithe is simply as a cultural thing, that this is what people did whenever they went to war and they defeated the armies. They would also take their stuff and bring it back to, their own land and offer it to their own priests and their own gods and kings. In my opinion, this is a better way to look at what Abraham did because it's actually rooted more in biblical and historical truth. In other words, again, Abraham's tithe was more of just a cultural thing than an adherence to some universal spiritual principle. The practice of tithing actually originated in the ancient Middle East. The people would offer a tithe of goods or property to a deity. And whenever an ancient nation would go to a war, which could have been Mesopotamia, Palestine, Greece, many others, they would give a tithe of the spoils to the king or their royal temple. And if you really go back even further, the number 10 itself, that number was believed to be a well rounded number and complete reasonable number to the Israelites and the surrounding nations. So whenever they would have to give something, they always figured that 10 or 10% was a reasonable amount to give. So Abraham was more than likely simply just following this cultural practice of their day by giving 10% of the spoils to a priest king in the area who blessed him. So many nations before and after the law, they practiced this rule. Later, this cultural practice was incorporated into the Mosaic law to provide for the house of God and the Levites, which we're going to learn more about later. And even David practiced giving a portion of spoils to the temple, which is outlined in 1 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 27. So the main question that is not whether or not Abraham was giving his tithe to show honor to his deity. The real question is this: can we establish that God has always desired all people to give 10% of their income to him just because Abraham gave this tenth? And the answer is no. Giving 10%, it was the culture of their day. When you understand the cultural aspect, you also understand that tithing was a cultural practice done by the Israelites and the surrounding nations. Tithing was accepted by God during the law and probably before the law in some instances. Tithing was incorporated into the law later on. Tithing was done during the time of Jesus. Tithing was ended as a requirement after the law ended with the death of Christ. Tithing was still practiced by some after Jesus died, of course, even though the law had ended. And tithing is still practiced by some today. Now, I want you to memorize everything I just said if you can about tithing, or at least try to remember some of these key points that I said about tithing. All of these rules, all of these characteristics are also true about abstaining from unclean foods, sacrificing animals in honor to a deity, and the practice of blessing the firstborn son. All of those things apply to those very same practices from the Old Testament. But it's interesting how tithing is the only cultural practice that has been made universal and everlasting. But if these laws and all these cultural practices, abstaining from food, sacrificing animals, and blessing the firstborn son, if all of those things have ended, then tithing has ended as well. So here's what this proves: the tithe of Abraham was not the origin or the establishment of tithing. It was a well known practice in that ancient land. To me, it makes more sense to look at his tithe to Melchizedek this way, just a common cultural practice that was accepted by God at one time. Later on, it was for an old covenant, which has now ended with the new covenant. This allows us to give whatever we want because we're free from the law and from cultural practices. And to me, it makes less sense to just automatically assume that it's just a universal principle that should be obeyed for all times just because it was done before the law. All right, guys, so that was great. So I'm going to see you in the next module.